Podo.
Welcome to the Ned Ludd Radio Hour. I'm Nick Hilton.
Welcome.
Here in the UK, it's starting to feel a little bit Christmassy. Fairy light displays twinkle on regional high streets. Little kids try on the elf costumes that they're going to wear for 3 straight weeks. And shops and restaurants put out posters calling for extra labour. Want to be a Christmas helper at the supermarket? Well, they're offering £11.50 an hour and 15% off your groceries. Seasonal work is all fine and good, but the current labour market is a weird place. I'm no economist, and I appreciate that actual economists would look at the current employment state in most of the West and be largely unconcerned. Here in the UK, after all, we seem to have a dearth of available workers to fill these low-level jobs. This is blamed by those of a liberal persuasion on the fallout of the Brexit vote. I imagine that there is a similar analysis raised in the US after the tightening of immigration from Central and South America. From the right, though, it's blamed on a cushy sense of entitlement among young Brits. They come to the same point, really. We've come to expect that low-paid, low-status jobs in our society will be done by immigrants. But there is something else, I suspect, because hospitality and retail seem to be slashing worker numbers with a zeal that would please Elon Musk. I went to Sainsbury's twice this past week, not to brag. It's a big Sainsbury's, a Sainsbury's of truly American proportions. On both occasions, there was one manned checkout running. 20 or 30 self-checkouts with a single staff member buzzing around offering ID approvals on bottles of Baileys or suspicious quantities of chef's knives. But only one checkout for actual people with full trolley loads of produce. And I had a similar experience in a major high street coffee shop. Its name is French for ready to eat, not to give it away too much. Where they only had one employee taking orders and making the coffee. She was so frazzled by this back and forth, the queue so long and unconquerable, that I felt sorry for her. All the same, the pity was tempered when I had to abandon the drink I'd ordered and paid for in order to run for my train. When I raised this question about understaffing on Twitter recently, I got a reply from someone saying that they had set off the alarm in Boots the other day and had to go hunting for someone to check the tags. She, the worker, said shoplifting is such a problem. Not surprised given how easy it is. Boots is, for reference, Britain's foremost beauty and pharmacy retailer. It's a strange world, and it's getting stranger. There's no doubting that the advent of AI is already having a jobs impact, particularly in the worlds of tech, services, and the creative industries. Here in merry audio land, the tools now being regularly deployed by podcasters, AI restoration and enhancement, AI transcription and show noting, AI de-umming and de-R'ing, are all taking material work away from the human jobs market. That might be a good thing. It might keep the price of content reasonable in a lukewarm economic climate, but it might also be a way of cutting costs in an already thrifty world. The shop floor, which looks empty right now, ought to be resilient. It ought to be beyond the reach of AI capabilities for the next decade or two. Sure, we've got a few of those freaky Amazon stores where you just walk out with your basket, but there's little evidence of them catching on at scale, here in the UK at least. Though, do write in if you're based in San Francisco or wherever and can feel the robot supermarket taking over. It feels hard to know what the low-wage work of the future will look like. Jobs that compete directly with the capabilities of computers are obviously at risk. That ought to drive up the competitiveness of jobs like retail and hospitality, which, for the time being, are unstealable. Being a data analyst, for example, is currently a very respectable middle-class profession, but one that must have the little red dot of artificial intelligence's sniper rifle trained squarely on its chest. Is it possible that all these well-paid jobs in IT, which has created a generation of suburban income stability, are about to implode? Jathan Sadowski, my guest today, is an academic, and our conversation is going to sound a bit academic. He's a senior fellow at the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, University in Melbourne. He has also authored a book called, worryingly, Too Smart: How Digital Capitalism is Extracting Data, Controlling Our Lives and Taking Over the World, and co-hosts a much more successful than this one, weekly podcast called This Machine Kills. I recorded this interview with Jathan back in the summer, so if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll note that my hair is still shaved, whereas now it's long and lush like Hugh Grant. But that means that I'm not going to be discussing Christmas shopping, nor am I going to be asking him for advice on whether I should, pick up a couple of extra weeks of work as a gift wrapper at Waterstones. And here's a top Christmas tip. Books are very easy to wrap and therefore make excellent presents, even if people don't want them. But what we are going to be talking about is the history of Luddism as a labour movement. To some extent, everything that I've been doing with this podcast over the past couple of months and into the new year has been in service of that question. How can we prevent the current changes to the world of work penalising the poorest in our society? I sent this question over to Ned, who is predictably having a very busy festive period, and took an age to respond, hence why this episode is coming out late. Here's what they had to say. Sorry for slow reply, Nick. Been snowed under. Almost, no pun intended. The only proactive decision that tech investors are responding to in this era that we might call the late pre-artificial worker era is cutting. Human capital is the first thing to be cut. Cut, cut, cut. The question is coming very soon about whether, rather than cutting, they can replace. Optimize outputs while reducing costs. This should be a very profound worry. It will start in Silicon Valley, Zurich, Shenzhen and Zhongguancun, but it will be a growing concern among all employers. Increasingly, revenue is a project that requires patience. Reducing costs creates an immediate discernible change. There is no worker who should be complacent right now. Anyhow, with that warning ringing in your ears, here's Jathan.
I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and it is 6:25 p.m.
6:25 p.m. Well, have you had a nice day? You're speaking to me from the future, so how's it been?
That's right. I've had a nice day, a very long day. It is winter here, so it's quite chilly. Although we did get a little bit of sun, but it's very much a Melbourne winter, which means cloudy, gray, a light mist in the air at all times.
Okay, well, look, from the future, let's go back to the past. And if you explain to me your area of research, but also maybe segue without me asking into a bit of an explanation of the history of Luddism, because I know you're an expert in this field.
Sure. So my work focuses on the political economy of technology. So what that really means is, understanding technology as itself not only a social but a political phenomenon, as something that is the result of specific values and preferences and ideals that are materialized in concrete form in the technologies that structure our lives and our society. And understanding that as well is often driven by very economic goals around profit or efficiency and optimization, these kinds of things, right? And so that's my view on technology at all times. But I'm far from the only person who views it that way. In fact, there is very much a long history of understanding technology as something that is the result of political and economic forces acting on people and society. Although I think that understanding of it has for a long time been somewhat lost in our discourses around technology.
And then the kind of the example of this, I guess, is the Luddites here in my home country. Can you kind of talk us through what that moment back at the start of, I guess, the Industrial Revolution looked like, and kind of the impact it had, and why it still inspires people like both of us to the present day?
So the Luddites, right? We're talking about the very early 1800s, around 1811 or so, is the first Luddite riots, and they were really these the beginning of the industrial age, and so you have this sudden growth of the dark satanic mills, right? These factories that are filled with machinery that are driven by capital and these kind of relatively still new and growing ideals around capitalism and profit and the creation of things at mass scales rather than these more kind of local artisanal crafts that people were really used to, right? And so the Luddites then were originally factory workers, specifically in textile mills. And they were on the front lines of industrialization in a lot of ways, both at temporally at the time period, but also very physically in terms of they were in the factories, they were working the machines, they were the kind of the test bed of a lot of industrial capital at that time. How can we speed up the pace of work? How can we make things faster and cheaper? And how can we do it by getting more labor out of people and paying them less money for that labor, right? And so this is really the conditions in which the Luddites arise.
And so when you talk about Luddism, you talk about it then, you talk about neo-Luddism going into the modern era. You're talking about a relationship between technology and labor. Is that right?
That's right. I always understand and I advocate that we must all understand the Luddites as first and foremost a labor movement, right? We think of it as this kind of group that were technophobic or primitivist in some ways, that they were afraid of progress, afraid of innovation, and that manifests in this kind of just wanton rage of picking up a hammer and swinging it at the nearest hunk of metal and wood that they could find. But that's far from the case, right? The Luddites were a labor movement. They were always about securing their rights, securing their autonomy, securing the safety and security of their communities and their families. And for them, it wasn't as well that they weren't afraid of the technology, nor did they think that the technology was replacing them, right? Which is often something we hear now when we think of labor and technology. It's about automation, replacing workers, and so on. They weren't even afraid of that. Instead, what they knew was that the machinery was the pointy end of the boss, right? The machinery was a representative of the boss in the sense that the factories, the machines that they were using and that they are famous for smashing were the things that were immiserating their lives in a really direct way, making their work more dangerous, making their work faster, denigrating the quality of their work, and doing so because it was the values of the capitalist, right? And so when they were swinging their hammers, they weren't swinging it at technology in an abstract way. They were swinging it at capital, at the bosses, at the beginnings of industrial capitalism. That was the real target of their ire, because they recognized as well that capitalism is a system that has an inherent antagonism between labor and capital, between the workers and bosses. And they understand that technology is not something neutral. And when that technology is created by capital, then it's going to instantiate the values, materialize the values of capital. And so they understood technology as a kind of a battlefield, as a battlefront for this class struggle and this class antagonism.
Now I'm sat here wearing, £2 tube socks and a t-shirt that I was given as a kind of free giveaway. So I think it's fair to say probably that capitalism in the battlefield of the textiles industry in the early 19th century in England, I think it's fair to say capitalism won the day there. Did the Luddism persevere? Did the movement keep a foothold? Are there any battles that Luddism has won, or are we just living in a sort of continual fail state where capitalism always wins out in the end?
Well, you're right. I mean, capitalism did win. I mean, the legacy of Luddism is in some way a legacy of loss, but not for want of trying, nor for want of popularity. The Luddites were hugely successful in terms of their cultural image at that time, right? You had people like Lord Byron giving, writing odes to the Luddites, giving really moving speeches at Parliament, trying to sway the government to the plight of the Luddites, but successfully, the populace, the people, were on the side of the Luddites. They were not saying, who are these people that are standing in the way of innovation and progress? They understood as well what was at stake. But it is true that capital won, and capital won in large part because of the state, because of the government. This was one of the first instances of the government sending the military in to suppress worker riots on behalf of capitalist interest, on behalf of factory owners. They made frame breaking or machine breaking a treasonous offense punishable by hanging. And this was a very early battlefield as well, where you see the interest of capital and the state joining together. And this is also really interesting because this is also the time period at which you have Bonaparte, right? Kind of Napoleon Bonaparte, going across Europe, conquering, threatening Britain, right? And instead of sending the military off to defend against Bonaparte, Napoleon, they instead send the military to the north to suppress the workers, right? And so it really shows you where the state's real interests were at that time. And it was not with the factory workers, but the factory owners.
This is a real, this is what we call a hospital pass, a sort of question you'd be asked about when you were at 15, in a sort of subjunctive history way. But the Industrial Revolution, I guess at the time felt very bad, just for lots of reasons. Introduced pollution to the world, introduced all of these kind of supply chains that would come to be seen as very problematic, but equally it solved a lot of problems of the pre-industrial era. Do you look back and think to yourself, look, it's like just an unequivocal negative, the move from an agrarian society to an industrial society? Or do you take a more tempered view, or do you say ultimately this was a change that had to eventually happen? It was inevitable that humanity would industrialize once it had the capacity, and it's happened as smoothly as possible to get to the present day where we are now?
I mean, it's a giant question, but I love it
It's
as
a horrible question.
But I love it as a question because I do think it also actually reveals a lot in terms of, if we're talking about technology and the kind of critical reaction to technology, that is also requires, I think, talking about things like the means of production, the forces of production. And that's what you're really talking about here. You're talking about different, economic material conditions, different forces of production and means of production in society, and the societies that spring up around them, right? And that is what urbanization was. Urbanization and industrialization came hand in hand because urbanization was a direct result of the rise of industrial capital. You needed to create a proletariat, right? If we want to use the Marxist terminology, or rather, you needed to create, as E.P. Thompson put it, the historian, an English working class, which meant creating an urban working class of people who were packed together in really tight spaces close to the factories, creating a highly specialized form of division of labor, but also creating what economists call a large reserve army of labor, right? A lot of people who are unemployed or underemployed, who can be cycled in and out of employment as people die, as they are fired, as they, for whatever reason, cycle out of the factory. And so that way you have this constant churn of fresh labor for capital to extract and exploit a surplus from. And so that means then that you have a move between agrarian societies and urban societies, between feudal societies and capitalist societies, between pre-industrial societies and industrial societies. Right? You have this move that doesn't happen in a predetermined way. But it happens in a really specific way, right? Like urbanization could have happened in radically different ways if that urbanization was not driven by the needs of industrial capital, right? You could have cities that were built very differently, that looked very differently, that you could at the same time as well have something very different than the creation of an industrial working class out of an agrarian peasantry. You could have had some other form of class or some other form of subjectivity come out of it, right? But instead, it is true. It's what we got, but we didn't get it because it was predetermined by fate, where there was only one way for it to happen. We got it because specific conditions came together, specific interest won out in the end. And here I would argue, the interest of capital became the kind of organizing force around not just production, but what economists call social reproduction, right? The kind of the everyday life, our social relationships, family relationships, the way that we sustain ourselves every day, and the way that we reproduce ourselves into the next generation. And all that is organized around doing so for the purposes of creating labor for capital, right? And I think if we zoom that out or talk about in terms of technology, I think it also reveals a lot where there's no linear progression of technologies. And this is something that the Luddites really understood, right? The historian David Noble famously said that the Luddites were one of the last people to understand technology in the present tense, right? To understand it not as something that might happen in the future, but as something that has immediate material consequences for us right now. And I think this is really important in terms of artificial intelligence, where a lot of the skepticism or the discourses around the critique or fear of it is very much cast in this like far future of existential risk, right? But it's a I think an inherently anti-materialist way of understanding technology, which to me makes it very problematic, because it doesn't understand it as a thing that emerged in a specific time because of specific conditions and has very specific immediate consequences. It just kind of understands technology as this like abstract thing, as this abstract force that happens to us. And that's why the Luddites picked up their hammers, right? Because they said, well, I'm tired of this happening to me. I want to have a decision about how this works, how I work with it, and what it does. It's really saying technology should be subject to democratic decision making rather than an authoritarian top down decisions about what happens to us. And so for all of this, for me, is understanding that there's always contingency, but that contingency is always in some way structured by broader kind of social, political, and economic conditions, right? And out of that comes the technologies or the forms of society or whatever it is that we have.
Okay, well, from that impulse, we're now in a moment where we're seeing, at least in this country, where I guess the union movement has traditionally, and I guess to a large part, as an impact, a long-term impact of the Luddite movement, the union movement has been very strong in the UK. We're seeing a lot of industrial action against new technology, and even in the US, you see the actors and writers going on strike, and a large part of their kind of demands or their concerns about the use of AI, doing them out of background work and that sort of thing. But here in the UK, every day there's another. At the moment we're debating whether train ticket offices should be closed and replaced solely by machines, and that's going to be a huge wedge issue at the next election. So, are we seeing a movement of, whether you call it neo-Luddism or whether you just see it as the same sort of impulse, that sort of, as you describe it, a present tense response to technology, saying this is the impact that technology is having right now? These are the questions that it is trying to answer, and they're maybe the wrong questions, or they're the right answers to the wrong questions, or they're the right answers that have just bad side effects. Are we in a moment where you think there's a real chance that workers could smash their own spinning jennies?
Well, I do think that we are absolutely in a kind of a new wave of neo-Luddism. That's for sure. I think a lot of people are coming to it in various ways, but also I know just in conversations I have, in the writing I do, and the speaking I do about Luddism, anytime I ever describe what the Luddites actually were, what they believed, and how it's relevant for us today, almost always people shake their head and say, "Oh, that okay, I didn't know that. I thought the Luddites were, people who wanted to live in caves without, modern luxuries. I didn't realize it was actually a labor movement about the democratic control over technology." And they shake their head and say, "That actually sounds really great," and I think that people come to this realization because of what we see happening, the ways that we see technology being used that are so clearly against our interest, or at least not for our interest, right? They are for somebody else's interest or for somebody else's values to benefit somebody else who is not us, right? So when we talk about taking away the ticket offices, well, why are we doing that? Is that going to benefit me in some way? Is it going to benefit people who rely on the ticket offices, say, people with disabilities who want to travel on the train, for example, or older people who may not have access, or just that's the only way that they know how to do things, right? Like, is that benefiting them? I think the answer is clearly no. So who is it benefiting, right? And why is the technology being the alibi here for some other political or economic force, right? Why is the technology being blamed for things that you are clearly the one doing, right? And I think people are really seeing that, where the technologies are no longer these kind of magical things that drop into our lives at every, Apple launch event or something like that, right? Like, they are these things that we see being weaponized in really clear ways for interests that are clearly not ours, and oftentimes I think clearly against our own interest. Why is it that why would we you why do the Hollywood studios want to, capture actors' voices, do full emotion capture of them, do full body scans, and then also use ChatGPT to write scripts? Is that because it's going to produce better, more creative, more beautiful movies and TVs? I mean, clearly no, right? Because the CEOs of these studios are getting hundreds of millions of dollars in salary every single year, right? So and so I think, again, it's like every time we turn around, we see some technology being used or being blamed for some reason that so clearly seems antisocial, anti-human, anti our interest. And I think that causes people to not only look at the technology critically, but look at the people building, designing, using, and blaming the technology and saying, what role do you have in this, right? And that, to me, is really establishing the conditions for this resurgence of Luddism. Now, I think the question of what that actually looks like and as a material action, I think is wide open. I don't think it's going to be, picking up hammers and smashing them, but simply because we live in a world that is far more complex than the industrial world, right? Where the technologies are not these like wholly contained things that exist in
Yeah.
specific spaces, like a factory,
And,
right?
and it didn't work. So we've got one evidence there of a specific action that did not arrest the momentum of capitalism. So we should probably try a different pathway next time.
That's right. That's right. I mean, we're talking about technologies that are massive, dispersed and decentralized, complex systems, not thermodynamic, thermomechanical machinery. And you're right, it didn't work, and it didn't work because of the some reason it would not work today, because the state combined with the might of the state combined with the interest of capital would not allow it to work, right? Would not allow change to actually happen in that way. And so it does raise a question, well, how does change happen then. I think the mass union movements we see are certainly a way where that is how change happens. I think policy decisions around looking very critically at AI, these are ways they happen, right? In other words, they have to happen in these really collective ways. I think it goes back to the original Luddite movement as well, which is that it was not only a labor movement, but a movement of collective action and solidarity across people who were dealing with and grappling with the same forms of immiseration, right? And that's what it requires today, is understanding that this is a collective action problem. It requires social solidarity, social support, and that's the only way that we can actually face up to these really big problems that are not fundamentally technological. They are fundamentally political economic problems.
The Ned Ludd Radio Hour is a Poddo podcast written and presented by me, Nick Hilton. We'll be off for Christmas in a couple of weeks, but, top 2 or 3 episodes before then, something like that. The theme music is Internet Song by Apes of the State, used with their generous permission, and the artwork is by Tom Humberston. For socials, go to nedluddlives.com. And just a reminder, you can watch videos of all of this on YouTube. Currently, I think I have 3 subscribers, something like that, so that could not be less worth my time at present. But it's there, it's an option for you. Anyhow, enjoy your day and spread the word.
Probably tried pot, he said he didn't, and then he is a liar. Met your mom when she was passed out on the floor at a party, and that's what I'll let you out.